War isn't particularly conducive to holiday celebrations. For example, in the United Kingdom, during the Second World War, rationing was such that sometimes the Christmas goose was a faux goose, a goose-shaped potato casserole. Over in Germany, the flares that RAF bombers would drop to give targets for night bombing were somewhat ironically called, and forgive my German pronunciation, Weihnachtsbaum, which means Christmas trees. The standing joke was when you saw the Christmas trees, you would go in your basement and light a candle and wait for Bescherung, which is the German word for the tradition of giving gifts at Christmas, but also slang for a bad situation. Stories of soldiers trying to celebrate Christmas at the front during the war, like the Christmas truce of 1914, show that the Christmas season and spirit can survive even the hardest of times. But of all the Christmases of war, one stands out for the sheer desperation involved. The Franco-Prussian War, which began July 19th, 1870, is, in the wake of the wars of the 20th century, rather obscure. Certainly it's little known here in the United States. The causes were rooted in European politics, and as with any war, they were disputed. The issue, the throne of Spain, had actually been resolved when a dispute arose over a purported insult by Wilhelm I, King of Prussia, to the French ambassador, Count Vincent Benedetti. By some accounts, the war was a rash decision by an impetuous Napoleon III, possibly to bolster his sagging popularity. And by some accounts, it was all a machination of Otto von Bismarck to goad France into war in order to drive German Confederation. Certainly animosity between the two had grown over the latter part of the 19th century, and some historians have argued that the war was essentially inevitable after Prussian victory in the 1866 Austro-Prussian War. Both nations were on a rising tide of nationalism as well, driving overconfidence in their chances of victory. In brief, better Prussian organization defeated the greater numbers of the French army. The war was one disaster after another for the French armies, and on September 1st, the emperor himself was captured after defeat at the Battle of Sedan. The empire was overthrown by popular acclaim and a government of national defense established. On September 18th, the Prussian army moved to besiege Paris. Despite the defeats, the new French Republic resolved to continue the war, and the spirit of nationalism continued. Messages were sent from the encircled capital via a number of means, including famously by hot air balloon. One such message was quoted in the Glamorgan Wales Gazette, dated September 28th. Per balloon mail, which ought to leave tomorrow and to which I wish a safe voyage, we send you our best wishes. We are all enjoying good health and bear with courage the investment of Paris. The Prussians have not yet attempted any bombardment, but we are quite prepared to receive them with an effective fire. Our patriotism is unbounded. I speak for every class of citizen. We run to the fortifications with the desire to revenge ourselves and to save France, which we love more and more, and which we are determined to save. The city was prepared. The Birmingham Gazette reported in August that in Paris a siege is considered inevitable. Already the city is provisioned for 3 months, and additional stores are arriving. An August 30th report in the Nashville Tennessean said that 15,000 sheep, 40,000 pigs, and 25,000 oxen have entered Paris in the last few days. Paris had more than 500,000 defenders, although most of those poorly trained National Guard, potentially twice as many troops as the Prussians could bring to bear on the city, and more than 2,000 cannon. The city was ringed with 16 different significant fortifications. But despite the numbers, the well-trained and entrenched Prussians were able to beat back all attempts to sally and break the siege. On November 30th, the French made their largest attempt, attacking with some 80,000 soldiers. After some brief success, they were pushed back. Historian Alistair Horn wrote in his 1965 book, The Fall of Paris, "In 3 days, the great sortie had cost 12,000 officers and men. It had failed. The plight of Paris now seemed hopeless." And the siege was beginning to weigh. A British witness, Dr. Russell, gave a vivid account that demonstrated the situation in the Sheffield Independent. From time to time, when a horse went down, a group of men would gather round him, regardless of shell and bullet, and disperse and return to their places. No one could make out what they did, but the officers and men inside the Prussian villages saw this happen over and over again. When they pushed out their skirmishers to feel the way towards the enemy on the retreat of the French inside the walls, the mystery was cleared up. The skeletons only of the horses were left. The heads, even in some cases, were gone. The carcasses were disemboweled and the flesh carried away. They could not afford to lose an ounce of that precious food, and some, no doubt, were killed in obtaining it. Home writes that in the city, as belts were tightened, many a superb champion of the turf ended its days in the casserole. Among them were the 2 trotting horses presented by the Tsar to Louis Napoleon at the time of the Great Exposition, originally valued at 56,000 francs, now bought by a butcher for 800. As the horse population dwindled, Hone notes that the household pets followed. It was then that the signs feline and canine butchers made their debut. Oddly, he notes rats were essentially a rich man's dish, owing to the lavish preparation and sauces required to make them palatable. Writer Edmond Goncourt wrote in his journal on December 8th, "People are talking only of what they eat, and what they can eat, and what there is to eat. Conversation consists of this and nothing more. Hunger begins, and famine is on the horizon." French author François Sarcey wrote, "The whole month of December was terribly hard to get through. The privations increased as the stock of our supplies diminished. All the food that accompanies bread and meat had risen to exorbitant prices, which rose every day. We were all dry and had barely enough to look forward to better days. What about those who had no reserves? It was the vast majority of Parisians, it must be admitted." Sarcey gave his own odd anecdote. Many had bought rabbits, which they fed on peelings, while waiting for the famine to force them to make pies. At the time when I write these lines, I have near me in my study 2 rabbit brothers, crouched in a corner of the room, and who look at me with their big, frightened air. The housekeeper brought them to me, claiming that they were bored all alone in their niche, and that they were cold, and that they did not want to eat any more. This last consideration decided me. I received them, and I tried to distract them. I will be careful not to read this chapter to them when their sentence is pronounced. They would only lose weight with grief. Food was not the only concern. The winter was harsh. It brought some respite from the war, as military operations were essentially suspended, but also brought new misery. Dr. Russell wrote that the cold will bring misery unutterable to the Parisians, among whom there was no great store of wood, as they had not laid in their winter provisions of fuel. The plagues that desolate armies are nursed by famine of every scope in beleaguered cities: smallpox, typhus, hunger, a fearful sisterhood to be dwellers within your walls, an enemy relentless at your gates. For me, I now confess, the sight of Paris is now heartbreaking." Sarcey wrote, "I don't pity men too much. Most had their 30 sous a day, which many of them drank shamelessly. But women, poor women in those abominable December colds, they lined up all day at the baker's, at the butcher's, at the grocer's, at the lumber merchant's, at the town hall." As terrible as it was, the coming Christmas could only be worse. The Plymouth Western Morning News opined, "Famine's grim and ghastly form has indeed approached near to the beautiful capital of light-hearted Europe, and Paris weeps, but still clings to her cannon, the broken and empty platter lying at her feet. Horrible it is to contemplate the prospect of Christmas next to contrast with Christmas last. Even bombardment would have been preferable to the slow and sickening process of starving out Paris." The London Daily Telegraph worried, "The French outside Paris, the French of France, must be having but a dismal time of it, whether they be at the mercy of a German Etappenkommandant, or whether they still remain in the insecurity of invasion without occupation. Divided by faction, torn by hateful suspicions of foreigners and each other, and worried by their own mobiles and francs-tireurs. But ineffably more dreary and more dismal may be the state of the head and heart of France. How are they spending Christmas? In Paris. In Paris, the wintry sun of Christmas may set in gloom and despondency. The sun of the new year may rise only on famine and despair." Horne says simply, "The prospects for Christmas could hardly have been gloomier." As the population grew hungry and restive, the French army attempted another sortie. The Gloucester Journal reports that at Paris, Christmas is likely to be celebrated in a very terrible fashion. On the night of Tuesday the 20th, the forts again raised their thunderous voices and belched forth iron shower upon the investing lines. This was followed upon the morrow by an advance of about 3 divisions of the garrison, from 30,000 to 35,000 men, against a portion of the German 12th Corps. On the side of the latter, the fighting, which lasted several hours, seemed to have been chiefly an artillery engagement, and attended therefore with comparatively small loss. The French were, of course, repulsed. The failed attempt to break the siege represented a difficult fact. Horn notes that before the siege began, Bismarck had predicted in his cynical fashion that 8 days without a café au lait would suffice to break the Parisian bourgeoisie, and even the government of national defense had not seriously reckoned on a blockade lasting more than 2 months at most. Now, with Christmas, the 100th day was already approaching. And so one of the most bizarre artifacts of the day, a menu from one of the finest restaurants in Paris, the Voisin. It seems Le Jardin d'Acclimation, a Paris zoo, had sold its menagerie to the restaurant, from whose chef, Alexander Etienne Choron, had created an extraordinary menu that included elephant and kangaroo. Sarcy wrote a small number of restaurants remained open, either in the ordinary center of Parisian pleasures, from the Boulevard des Italiens to the Boulevard Montmartre. There we had, out of dilettantism, gathered for supper around extravagant and bizarre menus. Wolf chops featured alongside roasted elephant trunk and kangaroo, all washed down with classic champagne. The less fortunate didn't have wolf or antelope. Horn notes a man was fattening up a huge cat, which he meant to serve on Christmas Day, surrounded with mice, like sausages. The people weren't without resourcefulness. Writer Akias Salzburg notes in a blog that a book called The Besieged Cook, or Art of Life in Times of Siege, was published in January 1871. She writes, "Eating during the siege of Paris is fascinating because while many healthy staples of Parisians' diets were scarce or non-existent, it's surprising how many other basics, including dry goods like pasta and rice, as well as coffee, wine, and my personal food staple, chocolate, were still available. Even though the book includes, she notes, a recipe for onion soup without onion. Parisians managed to make do, although Christmas was still dismal. Sarcy notes most churches had closed their doors. Through the kerosene-lit streets, plunged in semi-darkness, sounded the rare step of some belated passer-by. We were tickling each other to make each other laugh. No one had the heart to have fun." There was disagreement over exactly how the Parisians weathered the storm. Sarcy wrote, "No, I cannot tell our brothers in the provinces too often. With what indomitable courage, and with what touching resignation, with what invincible feeling of patriotism this whole population endured the rigors of this long misery." But English reporter Henri Leboucher opined, "It seems to me that if Paris submits to the blockade for another month, she will have done her duty to France, but I cannot for the life of me see that she has done anything to entitle her to boast of having set the world an example of valor." The city didn't fall due to famine. In January, the Prussians brought in larger siege cannon, and the bombardment compelled the government to surrender on January 27th. It was a humiliating defeat that many historians argue resulted in political shifts and burning resentments that made the Great War unavoidable, a path that ties to the conflicts still ongoing today. But one immediate result gives context to the siege. Owing to the loss, 18 days after the surrender, the French left seized power, creating the Paris Commune. Historian Louis Ciatola wrote in a 2010 edition of Warfare History Network, "During the ensuing 2 months, more Frenchmen would die in the political infighting than had perished during the entire siege of Paris." It was a bitterly ironic conclusion to the heroic, if doomed, defense of the City of Light. So what is the lesson of the Paris Christmas of 1870? Maybe it's a lesson about the resilience of humanity. It's there to remind us that no matter how bad we think things are, humans have survived worse. Maybe it's a story about the foolishness of war. Maybe it's to remind us that we should look out for others that are in need, especially at Christmas. After all, there are people around the world today who are suffering from the effects of war this Christmas season. Maybe it's simply that the suffering of the people of Paris and the sacrifice of their cats and dogs, rats and rabbits, elephants and wolves is history that deserves to be remembered. There is an interesting story of Christmas during the siege. In 1843, a village priest had commissioned a local poet to write a poem to commemorate the renovation of the church's organ. The poet, Basile Capot, wrote the poem Minuit Chrétien, Midnight Christians, based on the description of Christ's birth in Luke chapter 2. The priest then asked a local composer to compose music, creating a song merely called Cantique de Noël, Christmas Carol. It is odd that the song, based on a Bible verse, had lyrics composed by an avowed atheist and music composed by a Jewish composer. That created some resistance in the church, but the song became very popular in France nonetheless. You would likely recognize the song as an American abolitionist later translated it into English with the name O Holy Night. While the story of the song is interesting, there is a particular legend regarding the Christmas in Paris in 1870. The argument goes that on Christmas Eve, along the battlements outside Paris, a French soldier stood up and sang the song. Touched, a German soldier responded with a carol in German. Both sides then engaged in song, and there was no fighting on Christmas Day. The story of the Christmas carol Silent Night and the Christmas truce of 1914 is often told, if somewhat exaggerated, but the story of the Christmas carol O Holy Night and the Christmas truce of 1870, much less known. Perhaps because we're not really sure if it happened or if it is merely legend. But even as a legend, it has meaning, because the fact that we share and value stories like that shows that we are seeking the humanity even amidst the horror of war. And that shows that, well, maybe there's some hope for the human race after all. Merry Christmas. Peace on earth. Goodwill towards men. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.